was born in Wellington, 1943, and spent my first, my preschool years there, living with my grandparents and my mother, while my father was overseas fighting in the war. And then when I was 5, we moved to Lower Hutt, and I went to primary school there until I was about 11. Then my father got a job in New Plymouth, and we moved to Taranaki, and I went to New Plymouth Boys High School, the Highlands Intermediate, and then the Boys High. So I got my secondary schooling in Taranaki. And then, as seemed to be the habit of young people in those days, the idea was to go to university as far away from your parents as you could possibly get. And so I went to Canterbury to study English and foreign languages. But my mother said, well, we spent all this money, we bought you a piano and we so forth, you know, surely you should do some sort of music. And so in those days you could do, I think, 2 or 3 so-called units that were outside of the requirement for your degree, sort of extra ones. And so I did Music 1, which was an enormous struggle because I had hardly any background. I was musically illiterate, really. I couldn't really sight read. I sort of could read, but not very well. So it was a real effort, and I struggled through Music 1 with a C. And then, but there were all these other subjects that the music students were studying. Of course, they didn't teach composition in university in those days. There was no such subject. But there was music theory, and there was form and composition, and acoustics and orchestration, and so forth, and keyboard and oral skills, which I knew that I needed. So I approached the professor of music at the beginning of my second year and said I wanted to change from an English degree to a music degree. And he said that it was a very bad idea. And that I said, well, I passed Music 1. He said, yes, but you got 48%. And the only reason we passed you was because you weren't a music student. You wouldn't be doing any more music. But he said, if you want to do it, that's up to you. It's no skin off my nose. So it meant I had to catch up the subjects that I should have done in my first year that I hadn't done, plus all the ones in the second year. So it struggled again, but after about 6 months, something happened, I don't know what, and or maybe I caught up a bit. It just took off like a rocket, and just worked really, really hard. Did nothing but work. Hardly spoke to anybody, very shy. Lived in a fantasy world pretty much, and thank goodness. And so I managed to get a reasonable music degree, honours degree. And in those days, your honours meant that you had to compose. Not quite sure how you were supposed to do that without having been taught it, but because you'd learned theory, harmony and counterpoint, you were supposed to know how to handle musical materials, and you'd learn music history, so you learned how various other people had handled musical materials, so it was just supposed to happen magically, I think. But it turned out that I had some sort of a gift for this. But then I was on an education department studentship, which they had in those days. It meant that they gave you a very small stipend while you were at university, and then you had to teach for the number of years that you studied. So off I went to training college after I graduated. This is in 1966. I went to training college, fully expecting to teach music in a secondary school, and we used to go on section, and it turned out that I was really good at this. I really enjoyed being in front of kids and having fun and so forth, and I had a reasonable sort of personality and looked like that was going to be okay. And then I got a telephone call from John Ritchie, who was the head of department, professor of music. He said, there's all these jobs going at the university, and they're at different levels, but there's a junior, assistant, almost voluntary position, untenured, of course. You might like to apply for that. So I did, and was given the job. So for the next 4 years or so, I was just thrown in the deep end. And at university, there was no preparation or anything. But I worked really hard, and then eventually was appointed to a tenure position on the staff. And that's where I stayed till 2003. And that was a very interesting experience in all sorts of ways. But I think because of my lack of background, I mean, most of the staff and many of the students were only a couple of years younger than me when I first started, were far more gifted than I was, and far more experienced and capable musicians than I was. I think I had a sort of a vested interest in finding alternative ways of going about things. I don't think it was entirely for that reason, but so I very early in my life started building curricula and skills that I felt weren't taught in the traditional way of teaching, particularly learning music theory, for example, or the whole business of problem of musical terminology, calling something something, but the actual thing that you're labelling is just a word. You've got no guarantee that it's going any further into the person. And the whole idea about, tonal expectations, for example, being a feeling, and how do you get access to that feeling, and also a way of communicating about it with a collective group of people at a feeling level, not just at a labelling level. This is something that obsessed me a great deal. And so I worked out ways of doing this over a long period of time. And at the same time, of course, I was composing because I was appointed. That was my research mandate. Creative work was a bona fide research occupation in a New Zealand university in the late 60s, early 70s. That's what you did if you're in the humanities. If you're in fine arts and a painter, you painted. And if you're a composer, you composed. So I did, and it was note-based stuff. I think basically tonal, quite a lot of influences, Berio I think particularly. But then along came the dodecaphonic tsunami, Stockhausen and Boulez and their disciples, and that absolutely completely derailed me as far as using notes was concerned. Their music made no sense to me at all, but I had to pretend it did, of course, because everyone else seemed to make sense of it. Turns out most of them were pretending too. It was a very, very interesting case of, I don't know what, of a whole intellectual community swallowing something because it was absolutely impossible, pretty much, unless you're enormously courageous, to say at that point, no, I don't think this makes sense. And I got to the point where I could use either an F natural or an F sharp, and it didn't really matter which one it was. Well, I was stuffed. I couldn't make any decisions really. I knew that I couldn't. Then I discovered the tape recorder, and that was the way out, because I didn't have to choose notes any longer. Not only that, there wasn't any pedagogy anyway. There was nothing. There were no computers, of course. I was isolated in the South Pacific. I found an old Ferrograph monaural tape recorder under the stairs of the music department and a beautiful ribbon microphone. And I plugged it in and recorded my voice, and I was gone. It was direct, didn't have to write it down, suited me perfectly, and it also suited this sort of alternative approach that seemed to be developing in me towards just about everything. As I say now, in retrospect, I'm not so certain about the validity of that. Maybe it came from a defensiveness, I don't know, but it was definitely there. And then, of course, this I'm talking about late 60s, early 70s. And Douglas's studio had been going since 65, I think. And he was running weekend workshops for teachers, tape recorders in the classroom, I think he called it. And so I trundled up to Wellington, and he had lots of tape recorders and various other gizmos, filters and things. And I thought, this is very interesting. So I asked him if I could come and work in the studio that he had. It wasn't really a studio, it was just a collection of old junk, really. And he agreed, because I'd had some music, conventional music played on radio by then. I had some sort of very minimal profile. And he was enormously supportive, as he was with all of my generation, actually. Of course, one was in complete awe of him, you know. I mean, he was the composer, and knew all these other poets and painters, and this whole social world that he inhabited, that you would enter into when you came to visit, was enormously well, frightening, actually. But also, you got the feeling that if you were actually acceptable there, then maybe you had something to offer. Basically, that's the way it worked. So I would go and stay in his house and work in the studios when he went down to Cromwell to stay in his batch that he had down in Cromwell. So over the next 2 or 3 years, just about every May and August holidays, up I'd go to Wellington and work in the studio there. He showed you how to turn things on and had a few do's and don'ts, but basically that was it. There was no instruction, really, at all. There was a response to whatever you made when he came back. Very minimal, though. You got to know from his particular habits whether he approved or not. Well, he usually knew if he approved if he asked you back again, basically. So, and you met other people, Jack Boddy and John Rimmer, and people like that. They were all working in there too, and other times and so on. And then when I went overseas for the first time in 72, 73, I went to Toronto, where Douglas had gone. We all stayed in the same boarding house, you know, and so forth. There was this tradition of people going to that place. I did some work in the studios there and visited other studios in Europe and America over about an 8-month period in order to come back to Canterbury and begin building an electronic music studio at Canterbury, and that's what happened. And gradually evolved into the digital era in the 90s. I think it was quite late before I was prepared to accept a computer. There were lots of people ramming them down my throat before then, but as far as I could see, they weren't capable of doing anything very much, and they actually weren't. They were pretty rudimentary, and they were even when we finally converted. So that was an interesting facet of my life in the university, and for a long time, I forget when Chris Cree Brown was appointed to the department, but it was in the 80s. I think it was. The studios had been going for a number of years, and I was the only staff member involved, so I didn't have to worry about anybody else's aesthetic or point of view. I could just, and that was my working facility. I didn't have anywhere else to work. This place didn't exist, so my working studio was also the studio I used to teach other students, and other students worked in it. And this became a bit of a problem, really, because they'd break it all the time. And this would really piss me off. So, and I look back now and I think I behaved pretty badly on a number of occasions. But anyway, then we got the opportunity to buy the property next to our house. This property had an old house on it. And so I could turn that into a basic studio. And I was doing a lot of sculptural installation, performance work during the 80s. So I needed a workshop where I could build stuff and so on. And this old house was just perfect. And then they widened the road and knocked the house over. And so then we built this newer facility about 15 years ago. So that's how the interest in noise-based spectra rather than pitch space happened. I think I would have gone in that way anyway, but I think 1977 was the last time I wrote a note. I just very quickly atrophied and was replaced by noise-based stuff and performance and body installation. A lot of my teaching practice, where I used physical movements to inhabit tonal cadences as a way of trying to get people to feel what was stable and what was not, equating gravity with the tonic and balance. If you're off balance, then you want to come back to balance again. Working out a whole system of body movements that would reflect the tonal architecture of sonata form, for example. And that then transferred across to stuff that I was doing individually in my own work, using the body in a variety of ways, and the voice, and narrative, and fabricated objects of various sorts. So, and I think didn't have any technician in the Canterbury when I started. I had to sort of put everything together myself. The French department had a technician who was Dutch, trained Philips or somewhere, and knew how to solder. So he taught me how to do that. And then the rest was just, initially just junction boxes and things joined together. I mean, it was terribly basic. But it, gave me the idea that I could do things myself if I was prepared to get a bloody nose often enough. And that stayed. That's how this has been built. I mean, it's number 8 fencing wire, but it works. And it exists. So, and I don't think, again, talking about luck, I think if I hadn't been as isolated or as contrary, I don't think that would have progressed in that way. I would have felt I'd have to go and get training somewhere, So the whole idea of just going inwards, down inside myself and inside my own culture, my own narrative and history, and mining that for everything really, it suited my personality. I was an only child, very introverted, no father for a long time because he wasn't there, difficulties in the family after he got back, all that sort of, so you go inside because that's where it's safe. A lot of the works I make still happen in the dark. And even some of the images are very, very dark. They float in this sort of void. I really like darkness. It's comforting, not frightening, I think there are psychological reasons for that. But also, the 50s, 60s and 70s in New Zealand were, where you sort of had permission to do whatever you bloody well liked. And with this particular medium, nobody could tell you otherwise. There wasn't a rule book like there was in Europe. And we were relatively immune, except for some of the long-playing records people like Jack Boddy used to bring back. And, we all had to listen to these and go ooh ah. But anyway, so the iconoclastic attitude just, I think, was a natural result of the conditions around me and my own personal preferences. Yeah.